idea of commercial security, the idea of private military companies, which is one of the things I specialize on in both Iraq and Syria. One of the scary things, of course, is the idea that in many countries, we take security for granted. It's there. What if it's not? What if you have to pay for it? Suddenly it's a commodity. And what I will do tonight is, although my book is mainly on Iraq, I will focus more on Russian activity in Syria for tonight's presentation. So one of the things that my research has shown, which is very interesting, is the fact that in 2003, we had the invasion of Iraq. We had boots on the ground, US private military companies, filling a gap that was needed. Many of those companies wanted to appear as if they were protective, providing security. These are American companies here. With the Russian PMCs, we see the opposite. There are many, many Russian private military actors very active in Syria, and they are seen as much more aggressive than their American counterparts. We've seen a lot of growth from 1997 to 2013, and in 2007, there was even a debate at the Duma. The Kremlin asked, should Russian businesses have PMCs? Should we legislate them? And Duma said no. Why did they say no, you ask? Because Putin then does not have plausible deniability. So the idea here from my research is that these companies are used as a form of hybrid warfare, as a form of foreign policy by the Kremlin, who then deny that they're using them. In Syria, we see that the civil war, sadly, it's human tragedy, but it created a lot of business opportunities for these companies. And what we see is that although Assad is officially recognized in his partnership with Russia, there's a lot of covert rule going on. So groups like the Wagner Group, they come in, they stabilize certain areas, and then they sign oil and gas deals and perhaps leave. Now, what I found with defense contractors, security contractors in Russia, is that they have merged the logistics of the Russian armed forces with themselves. So in this chart, for example, we see that you have a commander. You also have a commercial director. So you have both the commercial aspect and the military aspect. We see here that Wagner Group are assisting the Russian armed forces in Syria in a way that we didn't see with private military companies that are of US origin, talking about Iraq. So again, the idea is that these companies try to create pockets of stability for Russian interests, not just in Syria, but across, for example, the Central African Republic and other places where they can strike oil deals, and then once they're done extracting resources, they may leave. In my work, I've come up with the term militarized resource companies, which is a term I use to discuss energy companies that no longer outsource security. They have their own militaries. Gazprom, for example, which is a massive giant, they have their own military. Arms are supplied by the government, and Putin, he once gave a quote, which I used for one of my articles, where he said, look, we will support our energy companies, but we want to control their work. And that means also political control. So on paper, the links to the state may differ, but in reality, these companies, they do the work of the government. And so one of Putin's associates has been linked to Gazprom, the energy giant, and also to the Wagner Group, which is a group of a private military company, someone called the mercenaries, who are active in Syria. And in 2017, we saw that Putin's associates were able to get an energy deal in Syria, where they said in exchange for eventually rebuilding infrastructure in Syria, they would get oil and gas contracts, they would get preferential treatment, they would control hydrocarbon production. So Syria is a part of the world where Putin is trying to make his mark, and he's using private actors to do it. Yes, so one of the things I tried to look at in my work is how are private military companies perceived? Now this is different from talking about their legal status, which is a very murky area, but I want to understand how are they perceived. In Iraq, what I found is that the general public accepts the use of private military companies as a form of outsourcing security. But if something goes wrong, they expect that the government should take care of things. So for example, the Abu Ghraib scandal, the 2007 Nisour Square massacre, which was Blackwater was involved in killing 17 Iraqi civilians. There was a public expectation that because these companies are American, the US government should provide remediation. And one of the problems we have with private military companies is consistently the lack of accountability. International law which is a framework to govern relations between states, does not necessarily hold private military companies accountable. They do not necessarily have a way of holding non-state actors or international businesses accountable, and this is an issue. So if we look at perceptions of Russia and the US within Syria, we had, back in 2018, what was called the Battle of Hasham in Syria. Ironically, both Russia and the US have backed separate offenses against ISIS. Okay? I'm sure you all heard about what's been happening with Trump withdrawing from northeastern Syria and the Turkish incursion, but they've been backing disparate offenses against ISIS, yet they found themselves in a firefight. So Russian-backed forces and US forces. So what I try to do for my research is to understand how are these forces perceived and who is perceiving them. So if we look at the headlines, the New York Times called this battle one between US commandos and Russian mercenaries. Notice the difference in language. Mercenaries is very, it's very illegitimate sounding. Commando sounds very much proper, very legit. And that's the New York Times, so of course they're taking the American side. The Spiegel Online, so the German paper, but in English, have talked about Russian deaths in Syria, and they've talked about the deaths of Russian soldiers. We're still talking about this company, Wagner Group, but they refer to them as soldiers. And in Arabic headlines, I'm going to try to read some of this. Basically, it says they've been referred to as the Quds Salama, and the shock force, if I were to try to translate from Arabic to English. So the idea that Wagner Group is doing Putin's dirty work and Assad's dirty work as a force that goes in, gets what they want, and then goes out. So the question then becomes, okay, so are we talking about mercenaries, or are we talking about soldiers, or are we talking about staff? Are we talking about employees? And this is one of the problems. A private military company is a company, it is a business, it is a private corporation. And this is a problem because it also means that when they get involved in warfare, we don't necessarily have a governance structure, we don't have accountability. We don't have a way of dealing with that. For Putin himself, he's taken things to the next level. Hybrid warfare is becoming an issue with private military companies. We are seeing more and more that certain companies are engaging directly in firefights, in conflicts on the ground, assisting in this case the Russian armed forces. In 2003, things were not that clear-cut. Private military companies, especially American ones, were seen as they were supposed to be protective. They would assist, they would, for example, escort diplomats, NGOs, but they would not necessarily engage directly in conflict. Now we're seeing a change in that. We're seeing that they are engaging directly in conflict. They are engaging in armed conflict, and also we're having the turn to drone warfare. I'd also add one point to which I have not been able to build upon yet, but in the Strait of Hormuz, with what's been happening, the tensions there, we also see a lot of increase in maritime security, and that is also another sector where private military companies may come to the fore as well. So thank you very much for your time.
So thank you very much for all presenters today, and for very interesting presentations. Before we start panel, can I remind that everyone, there's on the tables, there's the forms, and could you please write your name, and there's some contact details. Yeah, thank you very much. And please ask your questions or comments, and before you ask your question, could you please introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, my name is KDI here. I'm a lawyer and a publisher. It's a very interesting area that you cannot do justice to in 2 hours, actually. But I want to go to the gentleman who talked about the role of America and Russia as outsourcing their business. As a matter of fact, I'm from Nigeria, so I can tell you that the Boko Haram crisis in Nigeria, it's a business. Purely business. The generals are making money from buying weapons through corruption. Boko Haram was contained when South African mercenaries, I call them, came and fought for the Nigerian army, which has been weakened through corruption. And so it was okay. But a new government came in and they dispatched the mercenaries they're in trouble again. So it's a model. I think people have to have a mindset that you cannot solve the world's problem. It's unfortunate I have to say that. It's a business model of multi-billion-dollar industry. There's nothing you and I can do about it. We can pretend. If I get in government tomorrow in Nigeria, the generals will remind me that this is a big business. And obviously, if you don't play ball, America, Britain, Russia will cooperate and do what they have to do to get the business. But what I really wanted to find out is what is the policy for the lady that from LSE, I believe? What is the policy to change the private sector's attitude towards some of these humanitarian things? Because there's a lot of stuff going on with the humanitarian organizations themselves. It looks like they don't even want the conflict to end. And so if you're not in control politically, how in the world are you going to influence a conflict that has no end? There's betrayal in the system. I can tell you that. We've seen what Trump is doing. And so you cannot influence a man like Trump. The Republicans are afraid to speak. So how do you factor this into your policy? Because it's crazy. Everyone knows what he's doing is wrong, but his political party are afraid to call him to order. So you must change your policy one way or the other to be able to have a model, because I really enjoyed what you said, but that may be a model for maybe Africa, because nobody said anything about that. Serious stuff are going on there, similar things, it's just business, corruption, everyone is involved. So that's my take on it. So anyone can answer.
I suppose partly I would give you the answer that I gave the Kurdish business people. I think if you're talking about it at the level of foreign policy, I mean, perhaps what we, in Trump's case, a series of tweets which then unleashes an invasion, and actually how people are having to deal with that, and how they're having to live, their lives on the ground. And I think my view is that actually businesses, whether they're large multinationals, whether they're SMEs, local businesses, that the traction, the only way to counter this in terms of improving people's lives and not just flattering some politician's vanity, is to deal with the facts on the ground. And I think we can do a lot to encourage companies to think about their impacts. I mean, even very concretely, I'm working on a project, how do they measure them? Because that is something that mobilizes companies. If we can see what impact we're having, if we can be sure, then we're more likely to do it. So I think there are concrete tools like that. And what I've found in the last 10 years or so that I've been doing this is that companies are now much more aware than they ever were of being in the middle of these situations. They can no longer ignore it. They can no longer, years ago I remember asking a question at a press conference about Nigeria and Shell. Shell gave the press conference and I said, what's your foreign policy? And I was laughed at. But of course Shell had a huge political impact in Nigeria and what happened in the Ogoni Delta and so on. Shell wouldn't give that same response today. I think there's an awareness, there's a, to use a horrible word, a responsibilization by the private sector, and we need to work with that. We need to work, the UN needs to work with it, national governments need to work with it, but to understand the ways in which business sector impacts, both good and bad, can be managed and leveraged. I believe that's the way forward.
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Eric Francis Mendy. I was reading a report published 2011, which is outdated, with the title World Development Reports for role of private sector in a fragile, conflict-affected states. And a very interesting topic. I just listened to the gentleman and also the lady from LSC. So I'm not going to get into my apologies for that. I like the names that just mind. With on this report, they mentioned about the centuries of China, a conflict now, one of the superpowers in the world, Greece. We are in this world at this moment with a lot of conflicts going on outside. Now, if China able to overcome these barriers years ago, now that we are one of the biggest consumers in the world, how can we, the current conflicts, learn from them to overcome these issues that we can live in a peaceful world? Just anyone who can answer questions. Thank you.
Well, if I may, I mean, you say that China is trying to live in a peaceful world, but I think that if you were to look at different powers, I mean, China is also getting involved in the Middle East. But the difference is China seems to be very pragmatic in its approach to certain things. So what they're doing is they are investing, they're focusing on mutual trade in the Gulf, mutual interests, so education, for example. They are not getting too politically involved. Now, I'm not going to talk about human rights in China, but I will say this. One of the lines they try to promote is mutual sovereignty. They say, okay, look, we're going to do business. You don't talk about my issues back home, I don't talk about yours, okay? And I will admit this, one of the things about China, for example, and their activities is that they don't have the stain that the United States has in the Middle East, which is really from the 2003 invasion of Iraq. When I was working in Jordan, I remember one of the things I did was I liaised with different armed forces. And we had a meeting with the US Armed Forces for a military exercise they were going to perform. And the colonel was complaining that he said, ever since the invasion, when we go to Iraq and we try to set up projects, if one of my troops, for example, commits some sort of faux pas, does something that's culturally inappropriate, but it's a mistake, some of the locals think we did it on purpose because we have this image. China doesn't have that. And I guess the point I'm making is China remains politically pragmatic. They don't try to change too many things. And this is not a moral judgment I'm passing. I'm just saying that what they do is they try to keep things down to business as much as possible. I wouldn't call that living in a peaceful world per se, but I would say that changes things compared to what the US and others seem to try to do, where we're talking, the US has a history of basically invading, bombing, and also regime change. I mean, come on, there's that aspect as well. So I think that non-interference is one thing that perhaps the Chinese try to stick to if they can. Yeah.
So you mentioned in your presentation about how murky you found in research that you've done about the role of private military companies and their actions. In your opinion, do you actually think there is internationally accepted legal framework by which these people would be held accountable for what they do or what they did?
No, and I'll explain why. I'll go into more detail.
Please.
I mean, there was, for example, in 2007, there was what's called the Nusra Square Massacre in Baghdad, Iraq, where Blackwater employees, I'm not even using the term mercenaries, I'll get back to that, opened fire on innocent civilians. They killed 17 people. That case got stuck in legal limbo in the States, okay? In 2009, parts of it were dismissed on technicality. 2 months ago, so August, one individual was successfully prosecuted. His name's Nick Slappy, he was an employee. And a lot of people, a lot of Iraqis and Arabs said, well, this doesn't mean anything. I mean, look at all the other damage that's been done. And one of the problems here is we're going after the wrong people. You don't go after the individuals who committed the crime. You go after the entire organization for not having accountability. And how do we do that? This is not a military. This is a company. International law as it stands is meant to govern relations between states. We have various norms. What we do not have, which I think what we do need, are norms that understand the rise of non-state actors. When you have not just private military companies, if you can have a transnational company whose annual budget rivals the GDP of small nations, don't tell me they're not powerful, And that means that we do need new standards to be able to deal with that and to ensure that the entire company and the chain of command within that company can be held accountable, not just one or two, well, this is the problem. You basically need to get states on board, and are they going to do it? The answer is probably no. There are different forms of regulation which have been tried, codes of conduct, but the problem is it's all voluntary. So the International Code of Conduct, for example, and what's called the Montreux document, which restates existing international law but acknowledges that private military companies exist. What they've tried to do is they've tried to get these companies on board. So you have private military companies who've said, okay, look, we're willing to work with you to have some sort of code of conduct and to have as one advisor put to me, a gold sticker on our name. But number one, we know what needs to be done because we're in the field. And number two, if you want us to cooperate, you're going to play ball with us. You're going to play this problem. So for example, there are documents, codes of conduct, where private military companies have signed it, but they've signed it after the documents changed certain aspects. For example, they said, if you call us private military companies, we're not signing this document. Change it to security. We in this document, we refer to us as private security companies. And this is the thing, they want that protection image, even if it's not true.
So it doesn't take away from the corporate criminal responsibility.
No, exactly.
There are international rules and regulations that exist about corporate criminal responsibility.
Yeah.
So how about if I say to you that you could actually categorize these internationally operating companies, as you categorize them, rightly so, legally,
Yeah.
why would they not be responsible as much as BP, for example, for oil spillage, and that is a criminal responsibility, for example, because they are causing damage to environment, or because of whatever happens, somebody's killed, died, and they are criminally responsible. And then I know the resolution and the remedy you're seeking, legally speaking, is compensation and stuff, but then again, this is a company. Companies make profit, and if you're hitting them hard where they make profit through these kind of cases, then would you agree that that could be a path?
That could be a path, but there are actually two issues that I can mention. Firstly, you actually remind me of something. One of the companies that was involved in Abu Ghraib, the abuses at Abu Ghraib prison, they were sued. They settled out of court, okay, but lawsuits continued. And what they tried to do recently in 2019 is they actually tried to avoid responsibility by saying, oh, we have sovereignty like a state, therefore, if we are like a state, you cannot prosecute us. They lost, so the lawsuits will continue, which is a good thing. But at the same time, we have to ask a difficult question, which is, some of these companies, who are their clients? They're not necessarily NGOs, they are states. And to what extent do states rely on them? When the invasion of Iraq occurred, I can tell you that there were companies that sprang up literally overnight. Literally overnight. I mean, in some cases, you had retired generals who had contacts back in Iraq who said, I'm going to start a PMC with my contacts back there. I know who to contact, and we'll make some money. And they, at the time, they needed boots on the ground quickly. There was one company, Custer Battles, I believe they're called. They got a contract that they should never have been awarded because they promised to have boots on the ground within 2 weeks. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, you're right, the idea of having corporate responsibility, but are states going to allow it? When states are clients of some of these companies and are outsourcing warfare, and they're also outsourcing the politics associated with that warfare, will they allow it to go that far?
I think we should have a debate about this.
So that would be another discussion, definitely.
As was mentioned before, it's not 2 hours discussion. And Dr. Mary Martin, she has to leave now. So we will let you go, and maybe, Thank you very much for your very much. So, and I think we might have another 2 questions because.
I've got one more, if I don't mind. May I say Laura?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, good evening. Once again. So I've got some questions here before I came in, and one is, when there's a conflict in any state, you have the local investors, foreign investors, all living, taking long-term, short-term capital, leaving the country. So there's a less of jobs, investments, capitals. Now, this affects local individuals, i.e. local chambers. What do you guys do to bring these people back to the country, to mobilize and bring investment back to their states?
Okay, well, obviously, like I stated in my report, lots of companies are leaving many people jobless, but we need to have the businesses that are still in Syria and in Yemen to expand, and we need the government to be encouraging the the private sector from outside that have fled, or like other companies, to come back into the country and work alongside the government. And the government needs to try and give some aid to those companies in order to encourage them to come back and to help. Because if it's just the work of the private sector, then there won't be much made. So they need to come together as a whole entity so that they can try and build through that.
Yeah. Any other question? Yes. So once again, thank you very much to speakers about very important presentations. And I'll give a moment to Gianni Ferrari. He will give very different information, so maybe to share.
Okay, good evening everyone. I am Gianni Ferrari. I am the Vice President of Scuderia Ferrari Club and even President of Club Epicure International, that is a food and wine club for people that are loving food and wine. But now, I would like to introduce something a little less serious.
Excuse me, can you just sit down? Do I stand up there because the light is in?
Sorry, thank you. Sorry.
Yes, okay.
Something less serious, but I hope interesting for you. So we are organizing on the 12th of November, Tuesday 12th of November, with our friend Alma Farmer, a special event here in London because it's the 90 years of Scuderia Ferrari, so the racing cars. And we are organizing in central London, in a beautiful building. It's London Scottish House. It will be a particular event because there will be a fashion show organized by Alma. There will be supercars, there will be models, there will be a lot of complimentary food, Italian food, and drinks, wine, and even we have special awards.